Hi everyone, welcome to Learning Data Live 2019. My name is Caitlin and I'll be moderating this afternoon's sessions. Up next, we have a presentation from Amber Swope of Data Strategies called Let's Make New Mistakes. Sorry. Learning Data Live is brought to you by Scriptorium, the content strategy experts. Since 1997, Scriptorium has helped companies manage, structure, organize, and distribute content in an efficient way. If you're trying to figure out how the data model can best support your content, or you're setting up a data system, please contact us and we'd love to work with you. LearningData.com and Learning Data Live would not be possible without the help of our sponsors, so we thank them very much for their support. During the session, attendees are muted, but we still want your questions and input, so you can type your questions and comments in the questions module in the GoToWebinar interface. Please take a couple moments to locate it now. At the end of the presentation, we'll send out a link to a session evaluation survey to the questions module. So look for that and take a few moments to complete it when we send it out. Okay, and with that, I will switch control over to you, Amber. Are you there?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Awesome. And let me know when you can see my screen.
I see it.
Awesome. Alrighty, well, thank you very much for the introduction, Caitlin. And thank you for those of you who are joining me on this Thursday, the last Thursday in February. So I'm going to get started. And when I saw the theme for the virtual conference, I thought, well, what would I want to know about, how to have a successful implementation? And I've been doing this type of work for a long time. And so I thought, well, let's talk about, the mistakes that people have already made so that you can make new mistakes. So with that introduction, I'm going to head in. First of all, here's a little bit about me, and I think that's plenty. If you want to know more about me or my practice as an information architect, please go to my website, which is datastrategies.com. Here's a sampling of some of the folks that I have assisted over the years. As you can see, I am an IA to a number of different types of companies in a number of different industries. So I will attempt to cite examples from across the spectrum. All right, let's get started here, and let's think about what it is when I talk about mistakes. So when I'm talking about a mistake here, I'm making a little bit of a distinction, which is a wrong action or statement proceeding from faulty judgment, inadequate knowledge, or inattention. My goal here is that you will have the knowledge, so we can address the inadequate knowledge, but I can't help you with the faulty judgment or the inattention. And what the mistake can result in is failure, which is a lack of success. So we want to figure out what we can tell you so that you can not have this happen to you. All right, so learning from mistakes, we can learn from our own mistakes, but that of course means that we have to actually make the mistake in order to learn from it. If, as this cartoon shows, we don't want to go make as many mistakes as possible. That is not the measurement that we want. Rather, we want to learn from others' mistakes. So in order for me to understand where all of you are in your data implementation, I would like to get a little bit of information from you. So if we could have the first poll, please. What is your implementation status? Are you just considering this and trying to figure out what you're going to do? Are you actively starting your implementation, or are you trying to expand an existing implementation to provide new support, or none of the above, and you just have nothing to do other than join me today?
Okay, Amber, so I'm going to go ahead and start this poll. So go ahead and click which option best suits you. I'll leave this open for about a minute.
Okay. And this is important for me because I have a number of different examples that I can use, but if the majority of you already have existing data implementations, I might be going with something a bit more technical. If the majority of you are just starting out, I'm going to provide a lot more background information. So I appreciate your input.
Okay, we've got about 75% of people voted. I'll leave this open for about 20 more seconds.
Awesome. This is the hardest part about a virtual conference is because I can't see you and I just sit here and it's like, do we need some like wait music, like some poem music? I mentally am doing the Jeopardy theme song myself.
Okay.
So what do we got?
I'm going to go ahead and close this. So it looks like we have about 35% of people for researching approaches and strategies, 22% for starting an implementation, 37% for expanding an implementation, and 7% for NA.
Wow, I'm flattered on the number 4, but all right. So we have a bit of a split situation here. So I will err on the side of probably a bit more detail. And for those of you who already know some of this stuff, you might yawn, but I'm going to try to accommodate everyone. All right. So it says we want to learn from others' mistakes. And first of all, it was funny. I saw this quote, and when I saw it, it was attributed to a number of different people. So of course, I wanted to know where it came from. And it actually isn't a quote from any one person. And if you ever have nothing to do for 10 minutes, it's an interesting read on how it gets attributed to all these different people, including Eleanor Roosevelt. So, but this is a little, it's easy to say this, that we're going to learn from others' mistakes, but that requires that others actually share their mistakes. And one of the things that we tend to do is when we share case studies, we focus on all the things that we did right. And we are loath or wary to expound upon the things that did not go as expected. And I want to challenge every one of you who is considering doing a case study to reconsider that approach, because you sharing your mistakes is not presenting that you are a failure. It's providing people information so that they can avoid the pitfall that you encountered. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to talk about some case studies. I will not mention company names because this is not their case study, but where possible, I will try and give some details about scope and things like that. So I'm going to jump right in with the first common mistake that I see folks make. And this happens at the beginning of an implementation, but also when you're going to expand it. You don't take the time to go through and define what does success look like. How will we spot it in the wild, right? So the symptoms of this, so you can figure out if you are falling down this path, is that you don't know what your requirements are, that you have no measurement that you can, no action that you can measure upon the completion of your project or at specific milestones even, and that you end up with change with no improvement. And this is really easy to do, because what we get is we get told these goals, and these goals are very grandiose and vague. We want to be more efficient is my favorite culprit. And what does that mean? What does efficiency mean? Well, to any given organization, it could mean very different things. And the first thing, for instance, if you're saying you're doing an efficiency measurement, well, what are you measuring? Well, you can't very clearly make the business case for improved efficiency if you don't have metrics about what you do now. So I'm going to tell you right now, do not say you're going to do an implementation and the business benefit is going to be efficiency if you have no data on how long it takes you to do things right now. So I had a client that, they said, oh, we're going to do this business case on efficiency, and they just knew that things were painful. They had no way of saying exactly how long the content creation portion took, how long the content review took. They had no idea of how long it took to publish and deliver or translate. And and then they implemented their system, and they had metrics on how long it took to do those things now. But management was like, well, how much have you improved? And they couldn't tell them because there was no previous data to say these activities took X amount of time or X number of resources before they went and did their implementation. So this is where we want to know what are the business requirements and how do we measure them. So the other thing here is that when I say these are improvements, these are changes that are observable. You can't also just make statements around, oh yeah, it's more efficient, trust me. As soon as you say trust me, they don't do that, right? That's like the immediate trigger to make people suspicious. And so you want to have something that you can either prove with the prototype. So in the case of not having data beforehand, what this team did as a remediation effort is they went through a content creation and then a content update cycle using their old environment, and they clocked it. And then they went through and they did it in the new system, and then they clocked it. And so they, it was one data point. It doesn't a trend make, right? But it was something, and it was more than they had before. And then they could say, okay, based on similar types of content and similar processes, this is what we believe our efficiency improvement is. So our result is that there's a clear picture of success that the stakeholders can observe. And what that translates into from an efficiency process is, oh, if it took us 4 months to put out an update to content before, and it was holding up the release of a product, or it was causing some type of measurable pain to our customers, if we could get it out 25% faster, that means we can get it out in 3 months, then that has a measurable success in that we get to market 25% faster, and that makes a difference in some industries. So our next mistake that we want to avoid is that we are just focusing on what we, the content stakeholders, care about, as opposed to the longer term business goals. So I'm going to piggyback on the previous example where, it might take us time to do things, but if it doesn't end up, impacting the end business, that's something that, companies care about. Are we profitable? Then if we can't trace it all the way through that, then we're going to have problems getting folks on board. And so in this case, it was an industry where there is an external resource that says here is, in July, essentially the race starts, and all the competitors, they have the same starting point and the same starting content. The difference between which company gets the product out first comes down to the efficiency of their process. So in that case, they were able to, also get some data based upon how long it took to actually get through the entire process. Now, another example here that we could talk about is, making changes that are important to you, but that really don't map to the priority goals for the company. And so one of the things that's really tempting with DITA is to say, oh, we're going to focus on reuse metrics. All right. So when you say reuse, does your CEO's eyes light up and go, ooh, reuse, that sounds awesome. That's really going to make a difference to our bottom line? Probably not. So we want to know what priority one improvements would be that would make their eyes light up and make them understand that it's worth the investment in this project, and that you aren't just making change, but that you're making noticeable improvement. And, for example, reuse is a mechanism by which you can get other types of change. So for instance, if your company has a business delivery goal of expanding to support another, for instance, a vertical market that's related to a vertical market that you currently support, you can employ reuse in DITA via maps and conrefs and key refs and all the kinds of things that DITA provides in terms of reuse. That's not what's going to get your CEO's attention. What's going to get your CEO's attention is being able to say, hey, we did our analysis and we were able to identify that the new market is 50% the same information as the previous market. So we do not have to go and incur the extra time and effort and expense to support this product, which means that we can do a better job on the content that we do create, we can make better deliverables, and we can get it out the door faster. That's aligning reuse to business requirements. And if you can't do that, you're not going to get money to do your implementation. So we want you to not just say fancy words that matter to us, like reuse or content sharing and things like that. Talk about how they help the business at the end of the day in an observable way. All right, so it's time for another poll. So if you can start poll number 2, please, Caitlin.
Okay, I am deploying the second poll.
Excellent.
And so everyone can go ahead and click directly on the poll. You don't have to send in a question.
Excellent. So first of all, how do you know what your users need? Is it because you were a user that you have direct access to users? You have to rely on a third party for information, or you rely on some mystical device to divine what you think they could want?
Okay, I see about 50% of people voted, so we're going to leave this open for
Okay.
another 20 or 30 seconds.
And I'm going to speak to this because if you don't know what folks need, it's going to be really hard for you to have confidence that what you've delivered is going to make a difference. So let's see how close you are to your users and how you can find out what they want.
Okay, I'm going to leave this open for another 5 or 10 seconds, so go ahead and vote if you haven't already. Okay, I'm going to close it, and I'm going to share the results with the audience.
Awesome.
We've got about 8% saying they were a user, 38% that they had direct access to users, 52% that rely on another party for information, and 2% that use the mystical medium.
Wow. So, you know, that's, I'll be honest, I mean, the folks that are in that third category where you have to rely on a third party to get access, to understand what your users want, you have a high risk there, right? And, you know, so I work with teams and they talk about, you know, particularly teams that have already made the investment in data, where they want to leverage their existing investment to deliver their content in new and meaningful ways to users. That sounds great if you know what new and meaningful ways to users really is meaning, right? So one of the things that when you're relying on a third party to tell you what users want is that you're getting the information from what the users may or may not tell them through their lens of their interpretation. Now, if that person, that resource is a product manager, which means that they are the person who is responsible for defining how the product meets users' needs, then you have a pretty good chance that they have a good understanding of this, or your product will not be successful, and then the fact that your content isn't meeting their needs is really the least of your problems. If that is not coming from that person, then you're going to have to work a little harder and go and find folks like in UX and places like that. I was working with a team, and they came up with all these really cool ways to provide information, and then they neglected to take into account that a lot of their users were in places where they may not have internet connection. So getting rid of downloadable PDFs and going to an online dynamic portal, not going to help them. And instead of saying, oh, we don't want PDFs, or asking, and when you do talk to a user, say, do you want PDFs? Of course they're going to say yes. Ask them instead how they use the content. Because why do people want PDFs? They want PDFs because they want to have a compiled format that they can download, that they can print off, that they can annotate, that they can send to their other teammates. If you can provide them another way to do that, then you might not need PDF. You could maybe give them an EPUB or something that is a little better, maybe for delivery on a mobile device. I had a team that was really focused on, you know, the website, and they didn't own the website, but they were really, you know, they were locked into this website delivery. And then when they talked to their users, they found out that their users were all using mobile devices, and their website did not look good, did not resize, was not a good user experience. So all the work that they had done was pretty much diluted by the fact that the delivery mechanism, which they didn't own, didn't meet users' needs. So again, first of all, you got to find a way to get to your users, get a resource that you trust, make sure that you're asking the right questions. And, you know, first of all, you know, most companies and most products have more than one type of user. So don't treat all your users the same. If you do have personas, make sure they're accurate and make sure you understand in what context and what environment are folks trying to use your information. Because you can spend a lot of money on a transform to build PDF or something that they just can't use. And again, the last one, if you don't have interaction with real users, you're going to have to find a way to get the same information. You can't treat all users the same, and not all users are decision makers or your power users. So in order to avoid heading down this path, find out who your priority one folks are and really cater to them. Leverage your marketing personas, work with product management, and work with some prototypes. Before you make an investment on a long-term expensive delivery mechanism, do some prototypes, get some pilot studies going with some actual users or the closest you can get to them so that you don't spend a lot of money and get no value. So our result is, if we're doing it right, that we're going to make improvements that make a difference for the business as well as for our stakeholders and our users. One of the other classic blunders that I see folks making is that they, for instance, when they're implementing their original data implementation, they think they're going to bring over all their existing content. And I'm going to make a statement that some folks cringe when I make, because I make it pretty often. Not all content is created equal. And I had a team that did not take the time to go through and understand what was their high value content. And by high value, it is a relative term. You need a criteria for understanding this. And they spent a lot of money on translation of conversion for thousands and thousands of pages of content that then got into the system, were never updated, and were never actually delivered in their new format. So they spent time and money and resources on content that was effectively dead in terms of being a living organic, a living organism that is evolving and being delivered, you know, frequently to users. So, you know, what I want you to think about is doing an active triage, an inventory of what do you have, who uses it. So we're going to piggyback on knowing who your priority one customers are, right? And doing that content inventory, figuring out who uses it and how they use it and when it will next be updated, and start small. Don't go and convert everything out all at once. Do it in a logical way, stagger it, and then bring it through the system. And this is, you know, it sounds so simple, but when you're getting pressure from perhaps somebody in management going, well, you know, you have a milestone where all your content's in the repository. Well, I think you get to push back and say, what is all the content? All the content does not mean all your current content. It should mean all the content that should be in data, because it is going to have a life going forward that requires upkeep and maybe new delivery and translation, etc. So these are your symptoms. I'm not going to read them to you because you can all read. But on the steps to avoid, start off with that inventory. Make sure you have a criteria that everyone can agree upon on what content is most important, and then prioritize which deliverables you are going to actually produce. Your result will be a clear strategy, and this is really important because you want to do prototypes. You don't have time to do them all. And when somebody comes and asks you later, why did you bring this content and not that other content, you don't get flustered. You're like, oh, we did this evaluation and here's what the results showed, and that's how we made our decision. If you need that other content, we'd be happy to do an evaluation now and support you. All right. This is, as an information architect, this blunder just slays me. And this is when you take your content and you just bring it over exactly as it is. You don't take a step back. You don't look at the architecture. You simply say, oh, look at this. I'm going to bring over my entire frame maker chapter into DITA as a single composite topic. So because that way I have one file for one file. Well, why'd you bother, right? Why'd you do this if you didn't take a look and saying, wow, which pieces of this content set, let's say it's a chapter of a manual or a section in an online help system or a collection on a web portal. What part of this needs to be stored separately? What metadata needs to be there? How would we handle versioning? Does it make a difference when we send things to translation? When we deliver it, do we need to deliver individual units, or can we, what's the relationship between the delivered content and the authored content? When I send things to review, what does the collection have to be? So if you skip that step and you simply recreate exactly what you have, I ask you, why are you bothering to do this? And some may say that, Amber, you think this way because you're an information architect and you may overestimate the importance of information architecture. And I say, yes, I think that way, and no, I don't overestimate it. Because the time you spent ahead of the actual implementation to align the architecture with the content strategy will save you an exponential amount of time later, because it's easier to do it right the first time than it is to have to rework it under a deadline in the system later. So how do you know that you've skipped this step? Well, you don't, first of all, you don't even know what topic types you should be using, or you're putting everything into the same topic type. Could be another red flag. You have maps that are inconsistent. That will definitely impact your transformation and delivery. You have inconsistent or no reuse. Well, I mean, there may be a situation where reuse isn't appropriate, but if you think that that was one of the reasons you adopted DITA and you aren't seeing it, well, you didn't do your IA right. I shouldn't say right. You maybe didn't take enough time to invest in it to understand where is reuse or sharing valuable. If you don't have any metadata powering your delivery, well, here's an opportunity. And if you have improper element usage where you are overusing or misusing elements, it's because you didn't take time at this step in the process. And here are the steps on how to avoid this. And this isn't rocket science. This is a reproducible process where you just need to go through and give everything some scrutiny and not just recreate it as it is, because I've met very few folks in management that are willing to pay the expense to convert your content into XML and invest in the transformation and the tooling to manage the system and retraining everybody, only to recreate exactly what you have now. So this is where looking downstream at those other requirements will also inform why this is such an invaluable exercise. And the result is that you end up with a scalable framework for your content, your deliverables, and your metadata. And because we're talking about XML and DITA, I separate the content from the deliverables. We have our content units that get collected into maps that then get published, and you have your deliverable. And metadata is what powers that delivery. All right. This is another classic blender. I had a client that it came towards the end of the year and they had a chunk of money and it was a use it or lose it situation. They had been thinking about implementing DITA as a way for to structure their content, and they simply went out and purchased a system. They purchased a repository and authoring tools, and they weren't clear on why they were going to use DITA, how it was going to help their business. They never decided that they were going to spend the time to do the architecture. They spent a very large chunk of money and they never actually rolled out their implementation. They paid a lot of money for shelfware. And I don't want to say wasted time, because I do think anytime you're looking at your content, you learn something from it, but they didn't get the result they expected because they didn't do the work up front to understand what they were going to get out of it. And did they make a good choice on the tool? It didn't matter because they didn't know what they were going to do with it. So this is really tempting when there's a challenge with your content for folks to say, oh, what technology do we need? And to just jump into that and not look at the business part and not look at the architecture and consider what the process requirements are. And this company ended up never having a successful adoption. So we can avoid that. This is really easy to avoid, which is before you go spend money, think about what your method is for selecting the technology. If you know the vendors that you go to talk to, it's their job to make their products look great. So don't just take their word for it. Go in and be prepared. Have use cases and say, hey, this is our use case. Can you show me how your tool supports this? And that, again, that use it or lose it is just a killer. You're better off not, essentially losing it than losing it later after you've spent, not just the money, but the time and energy and political capital in your group. So here are the steps to avoid this. And again, I don't think this is rocket science, but this is a strategy to engage with your management team, because these kinds of decisions are coming from the top down. And rather than just having that knee-jerk reaction and going and purchasing something, take a deep breath, get your shields up, and go back and say, we aren't ready to purchase. Maybe we can do a pilot, a paid pilot or something. Because if they say, well, if you don't use any of the money, then we're gonna take it away. Well, there's the difference between using some of the money and all of the money. I think that there's some wiggle room in there, and I encourage you to go have that difficult conversation with management, because if you don't, it'll be a much more difficult conversation later. So if you wait to purchase your technology until you understand what success looks like, then you're going to have some confidence and you'll understand how you're going to use it, and you'll have a plan for adopting it. So we're on to our last poll, which is about your transform development.
Okay, I am launching the poll.
Excellent. So who's going to develop your transforms? So first of all, for those of you who are maybe new to XML, when you put your content in XML, you don't give your end users the raw data XML. You put it through the Data Open Toolkit and use a transform, as the name implies, that it takes that content and transforms it into a deliverable type, whether that could be HTML5, it could be JSON, it could be PDFs, it could be a SCORM package for an LMS. So that processing needs to be accounted for when you do your implementation.
Okay, I'm going to leave the poll open for another 15 or 20 seconds.
So I have to think of something to say for 15 or 20 seconds.
Okay, we have about 75% of people voted, so I'll close it in a few seconds. If you
Thank
haven't
you very
voted yet,
much.
go ahead and do that. Okay, and I'm going to close.
Awesome. Let's hear our numbers.
Yep, let me share the results with the audience. We've got about 24% saying you, 31% saying internal technical resource, 27% with external technical resource, and 18% with no idea.
All right, no idea, folks. This is your chance to get out of that situation and make a decision between one of the first three options. So the thing about transform development, it is a development exercise. That means that you need to be able to write code. And if you want it to be number one, then it really helps that if you're the person who's going to do this, you have to know how to write, to develop code. And this is a great skill if you are naturally inclined to do this, and or you have the time to learn it. Most folks are trying to put an implementation out into production, and you might not have time to learn. And I do make a bit of a distinction between when you get your transforms at the beginning of the implementation versus doing ongoing maintenance. There's a bit of a different skill level there. A lot of folks do have separate internal resources that do this. So maybe they have someone in IT or another shared service that has that technical ability to, and the time, don't forget the time, to actually write these code, the transforms. There was a reason that a large percentage of folks actually engage in external resource, and I'll say like the folks at Scriptorium, I've worked with them very successfully in the past with clients. And the thing is that when you have a transform, you may have a different transform for every deliverable type. So this is where the underestimating happens, is that first of all, you don't know what your transform requirements are. So you don't know how many transforms that you need. And you don't have the resources to even create them and test them and integrate them into your publishing environment. And particularly if you're paying an external resource, you have to accommodate for that budget. And so this is where I encourage folks to really think about this. I had a team that was all gung-ho. They were like, oh, we're going to do this. And they went and, we had an initial talk. They said, oh, we can do this on our own. And I'm like, good for you. That's awesome that you can do this on your own. And they got to the end and they got all their content into Ditto. And it was like putting it in a box, locking it, and throwing away the key. Now, the Ditto Open Toolkit comes with some out-of-the-box transforms, which is a great place to start. But I've never met a company that says, yeah, we can, just deliver something that has no branding. That just doesn't happen. There's a reason that your materials need to follow the corporate guidance, or at least have your company name and products names on them. This type of work, again, it starts with the first bullet here, which is, what are your requirements for each deliverable? Then you can say, do I have the knowledge to do this? Is there another internal resource to help us? Or do we need to go and get an expert to take care of this for us so that we can get up and in production in time to meet our product and our project deadlines? So get those estimates. If you're going to a third party and you tell them, if you walk in with really good requirements and it's a sample of the output of what you want, they can give you a good estimate. And then you also have to account for the testing in the environment, which usually takes a couple of cycles, because we think we know what we want until we get it, and then we're like, well, not quite that. So don't underestimate the amount of time and the cost for creating these. And then I've never worked at a company that over time things haven't changed. Let's say that your company gets bought out, or you change directions and your marketing folks come out with an entirely new branding scheme. Not that that's ever happened to anybody mid-release. Well, there will be impact then on your transforms. So if you do engage an external resource to create your transforms, have them do some knowledge transfer when they deliver it to you, to walk you through where are things that perhaps you or someone on your team or an internal person can do some updates, versus when it's something that you would need to re-engage with that external party, because again, you have to get budget for that, and you also have to make sure that you give them time. You can't call them up and say, I need you next week. That's not how external resources work. So have a realistic plan and a budget for developing and maintaining your transforms. So the last one that I want to talk about is overlooking your stakeholders. And this is when you're putting together your plan, whether it's for rolling out your initial implementation or for extending an existing implementation, that you don't pay attention, or you just aren't aware maybe that there are people who care about what you're doing. So for instance, if you're in the pharmaceutical industry, it's pretty clear who has to be involved when you're changing things, because it's a regulated industry, and there are points when content has to go, for instance, to the FDA. But in other industries, it could be a little bit more nebulous. And I was working with a team where we went through and I asked you, how about your stakeholders? And I said, here are some of the candidates of types of stakeholders. And they're like, oh yeah, we don't need to engage with, in this case, it was professional services, because they're in a different group, and we're in the product support. And okay, great. At a certain point, I have to trust you because it's your business. And we went through and we were developing, moving the project plan, and we're going to move everything into data. And then the folks over in this other group got wind of it, and they're like, whoa, we're implementing a system that, here's what we're doing. How is that going to work with our system? It got escalated all the way up to the C-level, where they're like, why are we investing in two different systems? Didn't you guys talk to each other? And it held the project up for 6 months. So this is where you, if you're a person that's, an individual contributor, might not know who else in the organization needs to be involved in your planning for your implementation. You're going to have, manage up, go to your manager, go to their manager, their director, whoever, and ask that difficult question. Who else could be invested in how content is created at our company? Not how we create our content, because it's not your content, it's the company's content. And this is where, working in silos, when it rolls up to the C-level, they're looking at it and going, why are we spending, $1 million on 4 different repositories? Why aren't these people sharing a repository? And a lot of times it's because those 4 groups don't even know about the other group and their initiatives. So you're going to have to do some legwork. And it helps if you have your requirements in place, because then, you can go through and say, when you do find another group that has a parallel, or what's going to be perceived as a parallel project, that you can compare notes and say, oh, here's the purpose of why we're investing in DITA. Oh, because they might be investing in some other source. So for instance, if you're trying to share with training, they might be moving to a system that might be both be using XML, but maybe they're using QTI for assessment or something like that. And you simply need to talk about, wow, what content could we share? What would it take for system integration? If we share a system, can it save the company some money? And if you go through and you know what you have to do, you find your use cases and then talk through the use cases. Because if you just go to another group and say, hey, I don't, do we need to talk about our content and your content? They're going to go, no. no, we don't. Because they don't want you upsetting their apple cart. So take the time to define use cases and walk it through and say, here's the content that the end user needs to receive. How are we creating it? How many different systems are involved? And make sure that upper management signs off and says, yeah, you're right. These truly are 2 separate systems, or whoa, you guys really need to talk to each other, because we think that the content could be a shared resource. And you want to find that out sooner than later. And, get that plan reviewed by the appropriate folks. And the thing about this is that it could take you longer to find who's appropriate to review this stuff than it does to actually get the plan reviewed, depending on how siloed your company is and how well connected your management tree is with other folks in the company. And I'm just wording that very carefully, because the reality is that, with dispersed and remote operations, sometimes your management team, if you're not at the corporate headquarters, might not have the visibility that someone else might have. So, be realistic about this. Don't skip this step, or you could pay later, and it will either totally tank your project, or it will delay it, and and you don't want to waste the money, the time, or the political capital. So your result here, to avoid that, is to know the complete set of users. And that, what I mean by users is people who are creating content in your organization, what their goals are and what their requirements are for each phase of when you might have to engage with them. So that was what sorry me, I thought that was my last one. So the last one is managing to change. And this is, let's say you do all the other things correct. You align with the business, you know what success looks like, you have a great understanding of what your end users need, you know exactly what content you're going to bring over, you've done your architecture, you've got the right technology, you've got your transforms development, you have everyone in place. And what have we not talked about here? The content authors. If you don't work with these folks and make sure that they understand, first of all, what's involved, why you're doing it, why it's a good thing for them, where the value is for them, then it's all going to be for naught. Because people, we can do all those other things, and there's all these systems in place. At the end of the day, people have to create your content. And I sometimes jokingly say that this job would be so much easier if we didn't have to deal with humans, right? Because we're complex beings. And we are motivated differently, each of us. But we share some of the same concerns about risk. If I am being compensated and evaluated based on my ability to produce high quality, consistent content, and you just waltz in and tell me, oh, we're going to totally change how you do your work, and we're not going to talk to you about how that change is going to occur. We're not going to get your input on what makes a successful authoring environment, then I'm going to feel disenfranchised, and I'm going to be very suspicious and unwilling to engage with you when you just magically just drop this system in place and saying, oh, you don't mind that we're going to change everything about how you work, right? Don't do that. Take the time to identify who the people are who are going to use the system. Communicate the value to them. If you're going to change how I author and give me a new tool, and let's be honest, authoring with topics is very different than writing in larger, more narrative forms. Then you have to explain to me the value, and you have to be able to prove that it's worth it for me to go through the change, because change is hard. You have to have a realistic adoption plan. You can't expect me to do this in the middle of a release. Come, talk to the team that you're working with. Make sure you understand, oh, there is a natural rhythm to how their work is performed, and understand that rhythm and don't disrupt it. If you're, for instance, at a software company and there's a release, then you want to go in and say, okay, we're going to take advantage of that time when you take a deep breath after a release before you start the next one, if there is such a thing. And that's when we're going to help you move into the new system. You have to have management support for the communication and the rollout of this. You might, maybe in your project, the request for the change is actually coming from the authors, but management isn't on board. Well, then you're still not going to be successful. Again, those pesky humans, right? So in order to avoid this, we want to make sure you have a complete set of the users with their goals and the requirements for them for each phase of the implementation. So if you're going to go and roll out to one group, for instance, if they're authoring learning content, make sure you have learning templates set up for them and not just expecting them to go in and try and figure it out on their own. If you have folks that are doing professional services content, well, what content types do they need, and do you already have them? For instance, if you're extending your implementation from tech hubs or tech support, and this of all of them, this one is sometimes I think the hardest, because it's ongoing. You're never done with this, because humans use the system, and as your business requirements change, your system will evolve, and you will be asking these folks to do things differently. And again, change can be disruptive, and folks do not like surprises at work, unless it's cake or money, or okay, pizza or ice cream or money, food or money. Don't surprise me at work, right? So I do believe that is the last one. It is. So because I'm a Star Trek geek, I had to at least have one Jean-Luc Picard slide. We want to learn from others' mistakes. We want to innovate with a plan. Innovation does not mean that you just go and brainstorm like crazy. It means that you make a plan, and that we want to make new mistakes in a controlled environment. I cannot emphasize the importance of doing proof of concepts, doing card sorts, doing an exercise that requires 10 hours or less to prove out an idea before you go spend a lot of time and money on it. Or do a pilot. If you're looking at technology that's going to cost you $100,000, $500,000, whatever it is, do a pilot with that first. Understand, is this really going to meet my needs? Because it's a lot less expensive to do a paid pilot than it is to do a paid implementation and not have the right one. So I'm hoping that there are some questions for me to answer.
Yes, there are. So I'm going to go ahead and my question slide up. Okay. So one of our attendees says that they want PDF so that they can include that document in their library. Is there another way to do things?
Well, when it says include it in your library, it depends on really what your library is. Is it like a physical library where you need a bound book, or is it a digital library where you have it there for maybe auditing purposes? Or is it there because you want to have a reference center that folks can download information from? I'm not saying that PDF's not the right choice. I think that you should go and look at your content strategy and see how people are using it and what this document's purpose really is, and determine if PDF is the output type that meets that need.
Okay. So in reference to tools, we have a question that says, this is the hardest part. How do you select your tools? This attendee says they have a list of requirements, but all of the vendors say yes. So how do they distinguish?
Of course they say yes. That's their job to say yes. And you distinguish it by having real use cases. And any tool vendor worth their job is going to come in and show you what their tool does well. And that's great if what their tool does well is what you need. So for me, when I work with folks, and I'll be candid, tools evaluation isn't where I excel. I'm much more on the content strategy end, the content information architecture end. But folks, you can pay an outside team to come in and do this. You can do it yourself, but it comes down to, I hate to say this because the vendors aren't going to be thrilled, but it's not sticking to their script, but going through here's a use case. Can you show us what this use case would look like in your system, and here's what success looks like.
Great. Oh, so we have some clarification on the first question. They were speaking as a user. They're talking about building a reference center from downloaded material.
Oh, so it's for the end user themselves to do it.
Yeah.
So there are some really interesting things around that whole idea of having a reference center, and there are actually some pretty cool tools out there that you can, on the delivery, you can essentially, as a user, log in, authenticate, and you can essentially build your own little library in the delivery platform. Again, it comes down to the requirements. Do you have to access it offline? Well, then an online repository doesn't do you any good, right? And if it has to be downloadable, are you looking at it on a laptop? Well, then probably PDF is fine. If you're trying to look at it on a mobile device, you're probably going to want something like EPUB. So again, go back to what the requirements look like, and who's accessing it, and what are the environment conditions or requirements.
Okay, and we have another question. What does transform mean, and what is the most common way?
So when you do a transform, so first of all, you have your data XML, and you process it using the Data Open Toolkit, affectionately referred to as the Data OT. And there's a transform plugin that the OT processes, and that transform plugin is written in whatever language it needs to. So a lot of them are written in XSLT, which is a programming language, and then it takes your data XML and it transforms it into another output type. So for instance, if you're feeding your content through to a mobile app, it could be in another flavor of XML. If you're feeding the content through to a learning management system, it's probably going to be another flavor of XML, like a SCORM package. If you need a PDF, well, then you're going to want to transform that generates a PDF, and I would leave it to the expert to tell you whether that is done with XSLT or another way. So it's called a transform because it takes your XML and it literally transforms it. I know I'm using the same word in the definition, which is a bad idea, but it converts it, for lack of a better word, into that end deliverable. If it's going out to a website, it could be a zip file with HTML or HTML5 pages in it. And if you're still thinking about what that is, I encourage you to go and learn more about how data works and how XML in general works and what that process is. There's a lot of education materials out there, and I know that the folks at Scriptorium would be happy to talk you through what that process is, because if you don't understand the process from start to finish, there's no way you can anticipate all the pitfalls. Do we have more questions?
Sorry, someone says, aren't there third-party tools that will transform your data content?
There are. And the reality is that there are tools that will facilitate the publishing. So there are some that I can think of, for instance, that will take your content and present it out as chatbots. There might be some that I know there are some that do take your content and, for instance, can transform it and present it for self-guided troubleshooting. But there is a difference between publishing and delivery. So, you know, when you deliver something, the delivery mechanism is where your user actually interacts with the place where they're getting their content. So the mobile app would be the delivery. The LMS would be the delivery. The web portal could be the delivery. But the act of publishing it, doing that transform that takes your XML into the whatever format of the files that gets served through that delivery, there are tools that sit there, and there are companies that, you know, again, you have to know what it is that you need to produce in order to know, oh, would this tool actually meet my needs?
Great. And then I think we have time for one more question. Can you suggest any solution against internal customers in the organization that neglect the importance of high quality content?
Motivation. I'll be honest, it's motivation. When, you know, first of all, you have to know what high quality content is. You know, have to agree on what it is. And then you have to agree on how you make it. And if they're in an environment where they're being compensated on meeting deadlines and only on meeting deadlines, you know, they're going to care, hopefully. They're going to have some investment and pride in their work. But if that's not how they're being evaluated, then they are literally faced with this choice. I can give you 100 topics that are okay, or I can give you 70 topics that are awesome, and it's going to actually take me longer. If their management is not supportive of saying, no, we want the 70, or maybe we want 50 because quality is that important, we'd rather have less content and we're going to handle the delta on what our users need another way, and it's better than, first of all, our agreed upon high standard of content. Unless you get that management support, you know, as a person who's just trying to get their job done, then there's no, they don't have they're not empowered to have that conversation. And again, it comes down to motivation. And I first of all, I encourage you to figure out what is the criteria for identifying high value content, because it matters by industry. If it's a pharmaceutical device, high value content is pretty clear, right? If it's software, well, what's high value content? And I think that you would have a very animated discussion in your group to come up with that. And then you have to say, well, how do we value that over speed, release dates, etc. And You know, if you're saying consistency is part of high value content and you do a lot of translation, that's a big factor to bring in that conversation.
Okay, thank you so much, Amber. Just a reminder that we have sent out the survey evaluation link in the chat module, in the questions module. So please take a few moments to look at that and complete it. We want to hear what you think. So thank you, Amber, for that. Thank
you. It was my pleasure. And again, if you have additional questions, please send them through to Caitlin and she can send them on to me. And Caitlin, I'm sure if there's something that I need to answer, I can send it to you and we can find a way to get it out to folks.
Yes, absolutely.